Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unpacking some really insightful and, honestly, quite complex source material. It's an essay titled, "Obedience Was Never Belonging."
Yeah, it's a fascinating look at the psychology and politics behind how certain groups get pushed towards compliance, often with this sort of implied promise of peace or belonging.
And it really dives into what the author calls conditional belonging, these unspoken rules that basically say, shrink yourself down to fit what society expects.
Exactly. And the essay looks specifically at something the author noticed. Substack's algorithm kept showing them articles, essays by what they term the ghosts of assimilation.
Right, these ghosts, the authors of those pieces often calling themselves tired transsexuals or gender realists, and they seem to be mourning a time when they felt, well, more respectable maybe.
Mm-hmm. And just for clarity, when the source uses gender realists, it's referring to individuals who really stick to maybe older established medical definitions of gender identity and transition. They often push back against the broader spectrum we talk about now.
Got it. So our goal here today, it's not really to debate those specific authors' views, is it?
No, not at all. The idea is to analyze the structure of that longing they express. Why does this push for assimilation or demanding compliance from others keep popping up? And crucially, how this whole cycle you get tolerance, but it's conditional, and then it often ends in betrayal, how that pattern shows up beyond just trans history.
Because the source author draws a really sharp line in the sand right from the start. They say their identity as a visible woman was never designed for assimilation. Their goal is different.
Completely different. It's about creating a world where, as they put it, disappearance is no longer the price of peace. You shouldn't have to vanish to belong.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
And that really sets up the core conflict.
It does. And the author gives us this great framework. They trace 7 recurring themes or notes in those assimilationist essays. And we're going to use those 7 notes as our guide today to sort of map out this landscape of control, hierarchy, and ultimately freedom.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Note 1. The myth of safety through respectability. This feels foundational. What exactly was the currency of respectability for this group the author's talking about?
Well, the main currency was passing. This deep-seated belief that if you could just manage a convincing performance of the binary norm, the right voice, the right mannerisms, the paperwork all in order, then maybe, just maybe, you'd earn a kind of permanent pass. You'd be left alone.
But the author makes it clear that this wasn't really a path open to everyone, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. The source describes the cost as, well, huge and really exclusionary. It wasn't just about medical transition. You often needed a body that was already pretty close to the societal norm to begin with.
Like maybe being a certain height or build, probably white middle class.
Exactly. Those factors played a huge role. So what they're mourning now, the author suggests, isn't some lost collective safety, but the crumbling of that very fragile detente they thought they had with power structures.
So it was never really about safety for the whole community. It was more like a private reprieve, as the source calls it.
Yeah.
For the few who could sort of blend in.
That's the core insight, yeah. The author calls it conditional tolerance. It's like a promise made by the powerful to those who discipline themselves. But it's a promise that just evaporates the second your compliance isn't needed anymore, or, when the system needs a new target.
The deal's just off.
The deal's off. And this is where that parallel the author draws with neurodivergence becomes so incredibly relevant, because it's the exact same myth that circles around neurodivergent lives.
Right. Tell us about that connection.
It's really the same painful mechanism, just like the so-called good transsexual hoped they could survive by assimilating. The person labeled high-functioning autistic was often implicitly promised acceptance, maybe even success, if they just relentlessly mimicked neurotypical behavior, what we now call masking.
And both of those myths basically demand the same thing. Erase your difference. Hide who you really are, hide the internal struggle, and maybe we'll let you exist alongside us.
Right, and the cost of that masking, especially in the ND community, is just immense. You have people pouring all their energy, maybe 8, 10, 12 hours a day, into performing neurotypicality.
Only to completely crash when they're alone. It's this survival strategy that ends up being utterly debilitating.
It really becomes its own kind of cage. And then when that performance inevitably fails, maybe through sheer burnout, they often find themselves discarded by the very systems, the workplaces, the social circles that previously praised them for being so competent or normal.
Which ties directly into the second note the author identifies, the grief of the assimilated, What are these essays actually documenting underneath the surface?
The author reads them as grief documents. These are people who, by their own account, did everything they were told to do. They went through the surgeries, navigated the psychiatric gatekeeping, learned the etiquette of belonging.
They followed the rules.
They followed all the rules. But they discovered that the state, the media, the medical institutions, they never really saw them as equals. They were always positioned as, like, guests in the house of gender, never quite belonging fully.
Wow. So they fulfilled their side of the bargain, but the promise wasn't kept.
Exactly. They mourn the illusion that assimilation could ever lead to permanence, to real security. The system that clapped them on the back for their competence ultimately left them feeling stranded. And worse, they'd often internalized this idea that their very validity depended on that external stamp of approval.
And that feeling, that deep sense of betrayal that seems to fuel Note 3, the recentering of authority. When the old promise fails, the instinct is to, what, double down on the old rules.
Kind of, yeah. There's this appeal to order, to responsibility, a desire to restore the gatekeepers, the clinicians, the psychiatrists, who they once saw almost like priests sanctifying transformation, as the author puts it.
They want the gates put back up.
They want the gates reinforced, yeah. Because they feel their own legitimacy, their own hard-won status is tied to the fact that they successfully navigated those gates back in the day.
But what's interesting here, the source suggests this isn't just about ideology. There's a real fear driving this, right? A sense of precarity.
Oh, absolutely. It's born from fear because, and this is crucial, the gate is actually starting to close on them too. We have to connect this longing for old authority to the very real material threat happening right now.
The unspoken why now.
Precisely. You look at legislation being drafted in, well, quite a few places. Bills designed to restrict access to hormone replacement therapy, HRT, sometimes tying it strictly to your assigned sex at birth or adding layers of bureaucratic hurdles that just weren't there before.
So wait, even if someone, say a trans woman, has lived as a woman for decades, passes completely, relies on estrogen, these laws could threaten her prescription just because of the marker on her birth certificate.
That's exactly the threat. The proposed laws often don't care about your social presentation or how long you've lived as yourself. They target the legal classification, that non-alignment with assigned sex. It doesn't differentiate between the visibly non-conforming person and the person who assimilated perfectly.
That's what the source calls poetic cruelty, isn't it?
It is. The very compliance that they thought secured their survival playing by the gatekeepers' rules has now become their vulnerability. They helped uphold a hierarchy that's now turning around and threatening to bite its most loyal followers.
It's a chilling warning. Loyalty to a restrictive system doesn't buy you immunity when that system shifts further toward repression.
Not at all. Which leads us into the fourth note, the anxiety of erasure. As the public conversation expands, including non-binary folks, gender-fluid people, neuroqueer identities, what exactly feels like it's being lost when the term transsexual isn't the main narrative anymore?
What's the core of that anxiety?
According to the source, it's the loss of narrative primacy. For a long time, the dominant story, often told through a medical or psychiatric lens, was centered on the transsexual woman, her journey, her transition, her solitary crossing. She was the central character, the main subject.
So they kind of grieve the fading of that specific script. The medical pilgrimage, the emergence on the other side, certified and reborn.
Exactly. And when the lens widened, when new voices emerged with different experiences, maybe identities that actively reject that medical binary path, people writing their own stories without asking permission. Well, to the assimilationists, it felt like an invasion, not liberation.
They saw it as undermining their story.
Right. Losing the centrality of that specific script feels to them like losing the history that gave their own lives meaning, that validated the incredibly difficult choices they made. It feels like erasure.
But the author suggests the story didn't actually end. It just multiplied. And that loss of control over the narrative feels like a betrayal.
Yeah, it's like having held a kind of monopoly on the official story, and now that monopoly is dissolving, there's a discomfort there, a mourning for the loss of that.
Yeah.
That strange, cold comfort you might get from being rigidly defined, even validated, by powerful institutions.
That anxiety seems to curdle into something darker with the fifth note. The conversion of pain into moral superiority. Can you unpack that?
This is where endurance becomes like a credential. Suffering becomes proof of authenticity. They might wear their history having endured really invasive psychiatric evaluations, maybe even sterilization and older protocols, almost like a badge of honor.
Okay, but isn't referencing past struggles to make sense of the present kind of human. Why does the source call it a dark alchemy?
Because it gets weaponized. It's used to create and enforce a hierarchy within the marginalized group itself. They essentially transform their own suffering into a benchmark for legitimacy, and then use it to judge the younger generation, maybe the more openly queer, less apologetic generation, as being, unserious or naive or not having paid their dues.
Insisting that real experience has to be validated by the very institutions that historically caused harm.
Precisely. And you see the exact same pattern sometimes in the neurodivergent world, right? You might have clinically diagnosed autistic individuals looking down on those who are self-diagnosed.
Right, insisting that real autism needs that formal, often expensive and inaccessible medical stamp.
Exactly the same mechanism. Confusing recognition by a powerful system with the inherent proof of your existence. And the source connects this to things like social contagion theory, this idea that trans identity or self-diagnosis is like an illness spreading among young people.
How does the author push back on that contagion idea?
They offer a powerful reframe. They ask, what if this contagion is actually just communion? What if it's young people recognizing something of themselves in each other, catching the possibility of their own freedom?
So the older guard sees contagion, or hysteria, because they can't imagine autonomy without institutional permission.
That's the argument. They project their own reliance on institutional validation onto a new generation's self-determination. It's a fundamental disconnect.
Which seems to pave the way for the political fallout, right? Which is note 6. The political drift to the right. Now, this is obviously politically sensitive territory, so just to be clear, we're reporting the source's analysis here.
Absolutely. And the source's claim is pretty stark. This drift isn't really a sudden betrayal of their past values, but more of an exposure of the foundation that was kind of always there. Meaning, the source argues this particular cohort wasn't often radically left-leaning to begin with. They were frequently more comfortable on sort of neoliberal ground, the reasonable moderate position, maybe socially liberal in their private lives, but fundamentally valuing stability, hierarchy, maybe market-based approaches.
And the source links this to the idea that tolerance under capitalism is often transactional.
Yes. The price for being allowed to exist quietly was often silence, a refusal to challenge the status quo too much, don't rock the boat.
So when the political winds shifted towards more open repression,
the far right saw an opening. They could flatter the assimilationists' nostalgia for order, for clear rules, for hierarchy. The source suggests these authors started believing, or perhaps already believed, that if they just helped reinforce the old rules, maybe helped close the gates behind them, they would be spared.
But the core warning from the author is stark, that compliance won't actually save them in the end.
No. When a system decides to crack down, it rarely makes fine distinctions between the obedient ones and the defiant ones. Eventually, it targets the category. Safety, the author argues, won't be found in trying to prove respectability to power, but only in building solidarity with the very people they might currently be trying to distance themselves from.
It's the ultimate, maybe tragic irony of assimilation. Believing you can be the exception when the rule itself is designed to eventually encompass you.
Precisely. Which brings us around to the final note, note 7, which really underlines everything. The underlying human theme is mourning.
This feels like the emotional heart of it all.
It really is. You have to see these individuals, the source suggests, as people who genuinely risked everything, their physical health, their relationships, their financial stability, based on a promise. The promise that if they just did everything right, followed all the rules, they might finally be allowed to live without being constantly under threat.
And now, the very framework that defined their entire adult lives, the rules they followed, it's dissolving or changing drastically.
Right. So their public anger, their political shifts. The author reads these as symptoms of a profound private mourning. The erosion of those old, often very restrictive frameworks feels like personal erasure to them, even when, for the broader community, it might actually represent liberation.
So the challenge is what? To acknowledge the history without getting stuck in its limitations.
Exactly. It's about honoring the reality of the suffering they endured, the difficulty of their path, without feeling obligated to preserve the very cages that caused so much of that pain. Separating the person from the policy, in a way. We acknowledge their journey without agreeing to rebuild the gatekeeping structures.
The author ends with this really powerful image, drawing on the metaphor of society as a kind of maze.
Yeah, suggesting that these oppressive structures, they weren't built to actually let us out. They were built to measure how much of ourselves we'd be willing to sacrifice, how much we'd shrink ourselves, just to feel a little less hunted within the walls.
And the assimilated They offer stillness, compliance,
Yeah.
as the way to survive the maze. But the author says, stillness is how the maze wins. Stillness keeps you trapped.
Right. Autonomy, in this view, is the refusal to play along with that choreography of control. And the final image is just beautiful. It's the simple, ungovernable act of a tall woman just reaching for the book she wants on the top shelf herself, refusing to wait for permission or for help, refusing the script.
Every act like that, every moment of self-definition, of rejecting the performance, it dissolves another wall of that maze. And it reveals, as the author puts it, the quiet, open field beyond where the rest of us are waiting. It's really an invitation, isn't it?
It is an invitation to start performing. We hope this deep dive gave you, the listener, a useful framework for thinking about this tension between control and autonomy and how these patterns of conditional belonging play out, whether we're talking about trans experiences, neurodivergence, or potentially other contexts, too.
So maybe the question the author leaves us with, and the one we'll leave you with, is what structures, what performances are you currently refusing to defend? What part of the script are you ready to let go of? We'll be back next time with another deep dive.